My name is Dr. Richard Thompson, and I was the main person responsible for what we called the God experiment. The premise was simple: to observe 7 selected individuals with the promise that their lives would be subtly improved by a team of scientists. In reality, our intention was just to observe without any real intervention. The participants were carefully chosen, representing a diversity of experiences and challenges. Michael Harper, a 35-year-old insurance broker, led a monotonous life, stuck in a routine with no great expectations. Caroline Evans, at 42, was a nurse dealing with her mother's terminal illness, overwhelmed and desperate for some relief. Courtney Rodriguez, a 27-year-old barista and transgender man, faced family rejection and the constant search for acceptance and happiness. Michelle Peterson, a 29-year-old software developer and transgender woman, had recently lost her job and lived under constant stress and paranoia. There was also Thomas Bennett, a 50-year-old history teacher, divorced and struggling with relationships with his teenage children. Rachel Wong, 34, was a marketing manager who, despite an apparently perfect life, faced an internal crisis of identity and personal satisfaction. Finally, Alex Foster, a 30-year-old freelance photographer, sought inspiration and success amid the chaos of his personal life and unstable relationships. The participants were informed that their lives would be monitored to identify and implement small improvements in their daily routines. These changes would be subtle, designed to increase their overall well-being and facilitate a more satisfying life. The idea was to observe the impact of these supposed interventions on their lives. To ensure complete observation, we installed hidden cameras in their homes and workplaces. The installation process was meticulous and discreet. Our team of technicians visited each location under the pretext of security checks and maintenance of existing equipment. During these visits, the cameras were installed in strategic points, such as living rooms, kitchens, offices, and bedrooms, always hidden in common objects to avoid any suspicion. The participants were instructed to continue their lives normally, without altering their routines. We explained that any changes should arise naturally as a result of the observations and suggestions we would make over time. None of them suspected the true purpose of the experiment, believing they were participating in a genuine study to improve their lives. With all the preparations completed and the cameras installed, we started the God experiment. What they didn't know was that, instead of improvements, what we were really looking for was to understand how the perception of being observed and helped would affect their lives. In the first days of observation, everything seemed normal. Michael followed his daily routine of working as an insurance broker, coming and going from the office with the same apathetic expression as always. Caroline continued her long shifts at the hospital, returning home exhausted to care for her sick mother. Courtney faced his daily challenges at the cafe, always smiling at customers, but with a sad look that betrayed his internal struggle. Michelle, newly unemployed, spent her days looking for new opportunities, while dealing with a growing sense of paranoia. Thomas gave his history classes with the same passion as always, but a silent bitterness seemed to always be present. Rachel managed her teams at work efficiently, but internally questioned every decision. And Alex, always with a camera in hand, chased inspiration around every corner, struggling with his own emotional instability. However, behind this facade of normality, small suspicious interactions began to occur. Michael Harper. For Michael, it all started with small memory lapses. He noticed that objects in his house were not where he had left them. A glass he was sure he had left in the kitchen appeared in the living room. His phone seemed to have call logs he didn't remember making. Initially, he attributed this to work stress, but a seed of doubt began to plant in his mind. Caroline Evans. In the midst of her exhausting routine, Caroline began to notice that visits from nurses and healthcare professionals to her mother were more frequent than usual. They asked detailed questions about her emotional state, something that hadn't happened before. Additionally, neighbors who had never talked to her began to be excessively friendly, asking about her mother and offering help. Although she appreciated the attention, something seemed out of place. Courtney Rodriguez. For Courtney, things started to change when he noticed an increase in random conversations with strangers. People he had never seen before began to talk to him about deeply personal topics as if they knew details about his life. Subtle comments about his transition, made by people he had just met, left him uncomfortable. He began to wonder if he was being observed more closely than he imagined.
Michelle Peterson.
Michelle, already paranoid by nature, began to notice strange patterns in her daily interactions. An increasing number of telemarketing calls, all seeming to know personal details they shouldn't have. Deliveries of packages she hadn't ordered and casual encounters with acquaintances who seemed to know too much about her current situation. The feeling of being watched intensified every day. Thomas Bennett. Thomas began to notice that his students were more curious about his personal life. Questions about his divorce and his children arose unexpectedly during classes. Colleagues who had never been interested in his life outside of school began to ask about his weekends and offer advice on dealing with teenagers. He began to feel that his privacy was being invaded in a subtle but constant way. Rachel Wong. In the midst of her identity crises, Rachel began to notice that suggestions and feedback at work were becoming strangely personal. Comments about her life choices and discussions about work-life balance became more frequent. Even routine meetings with her superiors seemed more focused on her personal happiness than on team performance. Something was not right, and Rachel began to feel the weight of this intrusion. Alex Foster. For Alex, the changes came in the form of fortuitous encounters with people who seemed to know a lot about his photographic projects. New contacts offered seemingly perfect job opportunities but required personal sacrifices he was unwilling to make. Additionally, his photos began to mysteriously disappear from his online galleries, only to reappear edited or with disturbing comments attached. These small interactions began to raise suspicions, but they were still far from enough for any of the participants to realize the true nature of what was happening. They continued their lives, each dealing with their own anxieties, while we, the researchers, watched every movement, every reaction, meticulously noting the effects of our experiment. In the early days of observation, Michael Harper's life seemed to follow its usual course, marked by the monotony and predictable routine of his job as an insurance broker. However, it didn't take long for signs of strange behavior to begin to appear. At first, it was small things like muttering while alone or nervous laughter for no apparent reason. He seemed to be losing control of reality, and this intrigued us deeply. One night, reviewing the day's footage, I noticed something strange. Michael was sitting on his sofa, staring at the turned-off TV. His lips moved quickly, but there was no one there. The sound from the cameras captured fragments of his one-sided conversation. He seemed to be answering invisible questions. His responses were incoherent, and his facial expressions varied from anger to despair. In the following days, these episodes became more frequent. Michael began talking to himself while walking to work, while at the office, and even during meals. His imaginary conversations became more intense and animated. He argued with an invisible interlocutor, gesticulating aggressively and, at times, seeming to beg for some understanding. As one of the main observers of the experiment, I began to worry about Michael's rapid mental deterioration. The premise of the experiment was that the participants' lives would be subtly improved, but in Michael's case, it seemed we were witnessing an alarming mental breakdown. His social interactions began to suffer. At the office, colleagues noticed his behavioral changes, although they avoided confronting him directly. He began to isolate himself more and more, preferring the company of his monologues to real conversations. One morning, while reviewing the night recordings, I observed Michael in a state of great agitation. He was in the kitchen, opening and closing drawers repeatedly, as if looking for something he couldn't find. He spoke out loud, his voice full of frustration and fear. "Where are you? I know you're here somewhere," he shouted at the empty space, his breath heavy. The following week, the situation worsened. Michael began to exhibit signs of paranoia. He covered the mirrors in his house with sheets and turned off all the lights. His nights were spent on watch, peeking through windows and checking doors and locks repeatedly. He seemed to be running from something invisible, something he believed was always lurking. As an observer, I couldn't help but feel a growing responsibility for Michael's condition. The cameras recorded every detail of his mental decline, and I found myself torn between scientific curiosity and human compassion. We were there to observe, but to what extent did this absolve us of any guilt? I began to question the morality of the experiment and ponder the possible consequences of our non-intervention. Michael was disintegrating before our eyes, and each day brought a new level of strangeness and despair. He became a puppet in the hands of an invisible terror, while we, the observers, remained on the sidelines, recording everything coldly. The God experiment began to reveal its darker side, and the line between observer and observed became increasingly thin. Michael's mental deterioration was only the beginning of a chain of events that would question our ethics and confront us with the true horror of the consequences of our actions. Michael Harper, who until then was just one of the experiment's participants, began to exhibit increasingly erratic and concerning behaviors. The changes were subtle at first, but soon evolved into something much more alarming. His mental deterioration seemed to accelerate each day, culminating in a tragic episode that no one could have predicted. That fateful morning, Michael left home looking more agitated than usual. The cameras captured his distraught expression as he murmured to himself, wide-eyed and with abrupt movements. He didn't seem aware of the world around him, as if trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Michael walked along the sidewalk, his steps quick and uncoordinated. At one point, he stopped in the middle of the street, staring at something only he could see. Suddenly, as if propelled by an invisible force, he began to run. His legs moved frantically, his arms swung uncontrollably, and his face displayed an expression of pure terror. Cars honked, trying to warn him of the imminent danger, but Michael didn't seem to hear. He ran directly into the moving traffic. The sound of screeching brakes and the impact of Michael's body being thrown were captured by the cameras with disturbing clarity. He was fatally hit by a car that couldn't stop in time. Michael's body lay motionless on the asphalt, life quickly slipping away. The news of Michael's death reached the laboratory shortly after. The observation room, usually a space of cold and calculated analysis, was taken over by a sepulchral silence. All of us researchers stood paralyzed before the screens showing the tragedy repeatedly from different angles. The sense of shock and disbelief was palpable. As the experiment leader, I found myself forced to face the harsh reality of what had happened. The premise of our study was to observe without intervention. However, Michael's death raised ethical questions that could not be ignored. How could we justify our lack of action in the face of the evident deterioration of one of our participants? Attempts to justify the lack of intervention quickly arose. Some argued that our role was merely to observe and collect data, that any interference could compromise the study's integrity. Others suggested that Michael already displayed unstable tendencies before the experiment began, and that his death was an inevitable consequence of his own mental condition. But deep down, we all knew these justifications were flimsy. Michael's death was a weight we all carried, a dark reminder of the consequences of our indifference. I began to question the morality of the entire experiment, wondering if we were truly contributing to science or merely voyeurs of human suffering. The God experiment had taken an unexpected and tragic turn. Michael's death was not just a data point in our study. It was a call to reality, a confrontation with the limits of ethics and compassion. And while we struggled to understand and justify what had happened, a troubling sense of guilt and responsibility hovered over us all. The thin line between observer and participant had been irrevocably broken, and the implications of our actions or inactions would continue to haunt us. After Michael's tragic death, the atmosphere in the laboratory was somber. However, the lives of the other participants continued, and our duty was to follow through with the experiment. Caroline Evans, until then an exhausted and overwhelmed woman caring for her sick mother, was the next to draw our attention. Caroline worked long hours as a nurse and dedicated almost all of her free time to caring for her terminally ill mother. Her days were an endless sequence of fatigue and worry. However, a miracle happened. One sunny morning, Caroline received a call from her mother's doctor. He had good news. The latest tests indicated that her mother was in remission. The cancer, which previously seemed invincible, had significantly diminished. Caroline could hardly believe it. She laughed and cried at the same time, a mix of relief and joy. This news should have been a turning point for Caroline. Finally, she could breathe a little easier, perhaps even reclaim parts of her life that had been dormant due to the constant pressure. However, instead of bringing the expected peace, this twist triggered a series of troubling behaviors. In the first days after the news, Caroline seemed to be in ecstasy. She smiled more, her eyes shone with new hope, and she seemed to have more energy. However, as time passed, I began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. Small things like her starting to murmur to herself or seeming distracted during conversations. I initially attributed this to accumulated stress dissipating, but it soon became clear that there was more to it. Caroline began to talk to herself more frequently, as if conversing with someone invisible. During one of the recordings, the camera captured a moment when she was sitting at the kitchen table, staring intently at an empty spot on the wall. "I know you're happy, Mom, but why now? Why after all this?" Her voice was filled with confusion and a hint of fear. Caroline's nights became more restless. She was seen wandering around the house, checking doors and windows repeatedly, as if expecting something or someone to enter. She began to cover the mirrors in the house, a behavior that had been observed in Michael shortly before his death. The paranoia was clearly taking over her, despite the good news about her mother's health. A particularly disturbing event occurred during one of her hospital visits. Caroline was talking to a colleague about her mother's remission when, suddenly, her expression changed. She turned pale, her eyes fixed on something behind her colleague, something that wasn't really there. "Don't you see? He's right there, watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The colleague, visibly uncomfortable, tried to calm her down, but Caroline insisted that there was someone there, someone invisible to everyone but her. As an observer, Caroline's situation disturbed me deeply. The premise of the experiment was to observe subtle improvements in the participants' lives, but what we were seeing was a downward spiral similar to Michael's. I began to fear that Caroline was heading for an equally tragic fate. We gathered the team to discuss the developments. There was a heated debate about whether we should intervene or continue observing. Some argued that the coincidence between Michael's and Caroline's behaviors might not be random and that intervention could compromise the experiment's integrity. Others, including myself, were beginning to feel the weight of responsibility and question the morality of our inaction. Caroline's situation left me restless. Each passing day brought new strange behaviors, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of another tragedy. Caroline Evans's situation worsened day by day. The good news about her mother's remission, which should have brought relief and happiness, seemed only to intensify her erratic behavior. Her mutterings turned into dialogues. Her nights were filled with constant vigilance, and paranoia began to dominate every aspect of her life. As an observer, I felt a growing unease, fearing that Michael's fate might repeat itself. Then something happened that none of us were prepared to face. It was a quiet night when Caroline came home after a long shift at the hospital. She seemed even more agitated than usual. The cameras captured her every move as she checked doors and windows, her frantic eyes scanning every corner of the house. She went to the kitchen, where she began talking to herself again, questioning the emptiness about her mother's safety and her own sanity. Suddenly, a loud, metallic sound echoed through the house. Caroline fell to the floor, hit by a blunt object that had fallen from a high shelf. The camera recorded the impact, the dull thud of her body hitting the floor, and the unsettling silence that followed. Caroline lay motionless for a few seconds, then slowly got up, touching her head where the object had struck her. Her eyes were glazed over as if she were in a state of shock. She staggered to the front door, opened it, and walked out into the dark night. The external cameras captured her figure moving away from the house, disappearing into the darkness without looking back. And then she was gone. There was no sign of where she could have gone or what she was planning to do. It was as if she had been swallowed by the night. When the news of Caroline's disappearance reached the laboratory, the tension among the researchers increased exponentially. The observation room, once a space for scientific analysis and curiosity, turned into a place of anxiety and fear. Michael's death had already cast a heavy shadow over us, and Caroline's disappearance only exacerbated the situation. We held an emergency meeting to discuss the next steps. The room was charged with nervousness. Some researchers tried to rationalize the events, insisting that Caroline was in a state of shock and that her disappearance was an attempt to escape her own paranoia. Others, however, began to realize that something much more sinister was at play. "We have to report this to the authorities," suggested one of the researchers, her voice trembling with concern. "We can't just keep observing while they disappear or die." The research head, Dr. Martin Green, was visibly shaken but tried to maintain composure. "Our job is to observe and record. We can't interfere without compromising the experiment's integrity. We need more data before drawing premature conclusions." I, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of responsibility and guilt. Michael's death had already weighed on my conscience, and Caroline's disappearance seemed a prelude to more tragedy. My mind was torn between professional duty and the moral need to intervene. Caroline's disappearance marked a turning point in the experiment. The feeling that something was terribly wrong was impossible to ignore. The tension among the researchers increased, and the shadow of imminent tragedy loomed over us, threatening to destroy the thin line that separated scientific curiosity from human compassion. The God experiment was revealing its true face, a face marked by fear, paranoia, and an unsettling sense of doom. The deaths of Michael and Courtney and the disappearance of Caroline cast a shadow over the experiment, but our work continued. Each tragedy increased the pressure on the researchers and raised ethical questions that were difficult to ignore. In the midst of this whirlwind of events, Michelle Peterson, a 29-year-old software developer and transgender woman, began to show signs that something was terribly wrong in her life. Michelle already faced a series of challenges. Being a transgender woman in the corporate world was a constant battle against prejudice and discrimination. Recently, she had lost her job at a small tech company, a devastating blow that left her adrift. Her savings were dwindling, and the search for a new job seemed increasingly desperate. Additionally, the disdainful looks and malicious comments she received on the street and at social gatherings were undermining her self-esteem. The cameras recorded every detail of her daily struggle. At first, Michelle tried to remain calm and hopeful. She spent hours sending resumes, participating in interviews that invariably ended in disappointment. Her expression became increasingly tense, and her eyes revealed deep fatigue. Over time, paranoia began to set in. Michelle noticed things out of place in her apartment. Objects she was sure she had left in one spot appeared in another. Whispering voices that didn't exist echoed in her head, especially during lonely nights. Initially, she tried to rationalize these events, attributing them to stress and exhaustion. But the feeling of being watched never left her. One night, after a failed interview, Michelle was sitting on her couch, her hands trembling. She looked around the apartment, her eyes fixed on dark corners. "They're watching me. I know they're here," she murmured to herself. In a fit of frustration, she began to search every inch of her house, determined to find the source of her paranoia. It was then that she found the first camera. Hidden in a small hole in the bookshelf, the device silently blinked, recording her every move. Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly discovered more cameras, hidden in strategic locations. In the kitchen, bedroom, even in the bathroom. The feeling of invasion was overwhelming. Michelle's paranoia reached new heights. She covered all the cameras she found, but the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. She began to avoid leaving the house, fearing that the surveillance extended beyond her apartment walls. The few interactions she had with the outside world were marked by increasing distrust. On a rainy night, Michelle was in her apartment, her eyes red from crying, her mind in a constant state of alert. She had locked all the doors and windows, but a sudden loud knock at the front door made her freeze. Who could it be at that hour? Every instinct in her body screamed not to open the door, but curiosity and fear overcame her. With hesitant steps, Michelle approached the door. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. There was no response, just more insistent knocking. Taking a deep breath, she turned the key and opened the door just enough to peek. The sound of gunshots broke the night silence. Michelle was hit multiple times, her body falling heavily to the entrance floor. Blood quickly spread across the floor, mixing with the rain that began to enter through the open door. The nearest camera captured the horrific scene, life draining from Michelle's eyes as the dark figure of the shooter disappeared into the darkness. When the news of Michelle's death reached the laboratory, the already tense atmosphere became unbearable. Panic and guilt were evident on all the researchers' faces. Attempts to justify the lack of intervention were increasingly weak and desperate. Some suggested that Michelle had become a target for reasons beyond the experiment, but deep down, we knew that our constant observation and the sense of invasion had played a crucial role in her paranoia and subsequent death. The God experiment had turned into a living nightmare. The goal of observing and potentially improving lives had given way to a series of tragedies that questioned our humanity and ethics. And while we tried to make sense of it all, the reality of our actions, or lack thereof, confronted us relentlessly, reminding us of the price of unchecked curiosity and indifference. Michelle's death was the breaking point for me. The accumulating tragedies, Michael's death, Caroline's disappearance, Courtney's and now Michelle's murder, weighed on my conscience in an unbearable way. Before more deaths occurred, I decided to investigate what was really happening. Something was deeply wrong with the God experiment, and I needed to uncover the truth. I spent nights reviewing all the available footage and documents, looking for any clue that could explain the deaths and the participants' strange behavior. The information was fragmented and often coded, but with persistence, I began to unravel a disturbing pattern. Firstly, I noticed strange details in the footage. Subliminal messages introduced into the videos the participants watched, almost imperceptible but disturbing sounds in the audio recordings, and even objects subtly moved to incite paranoia. It was evident that there was intentional manipulation at play. The documents I managed to access also revealed disturbing information. There were reports with enigmatic notes, encrypted emails between high-ranking officials and experiment funders, and internal memos that seemed out of place. I began to follow these clues, connecting the dots and revealing a web of manipulation and control. As my investigation progressed, a sinister connection began to form. I discovered that the experiment's funding didn't just come from an obscure scientific research entity, but was directly linked to government agencies. The emails and documents I managed to decipher showed a direct line of communication and instructions from high levels of government. The most shocking revelation came when I found a set of confidential documents stored on a medium security server, seemingly forgotten or neglected. These documents detailed the experiment's true intention. The God experiment was not intended to improve the participants' lives, but to eliminate dissidents in a discreet and efficient manner. Each selected individual had, in some way, challenged or questioned the status quo. Michael, with his investigations into corporate fraud; Caroline, with her complaints about the healthcare system; Courtney, with his activism for trans rights; Michelle, with her reports of discrimination in the tech sector. They all represented a potential threat that the government wanted to neutralize. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Using the experiment as a front, the government orchestrated situations that led these individuals to self-destruction or death, making it appear as accidents or consequences of their own mental instabilities. The researchers, including myself, were just pawns, manipulated to execute a much darker plan. The magnitude of this discovery was devastating. I was entangled in a conspiracy that used science and psychology as weapons to silence dissident voices. The urgency to act before more lives were lost became unbearable. I needed to find a way to expose the truth and stop the experiment before it was too late. After discovering the true nature of the God experiment, I realized my life was in danger. The details I had uncovered were disturbing. The government was using the experiment as a front to eliminate dissidents. Now, they knew I had too much knowledge. Without a doubt, I would be the next target. The signs that I was being watched became impossible to ignore. Anonymous phone calls, suspicious cars parked near my house, and the constant feeling of being followed. So I decided to report this entire story in this diary and leave it hidden in case anything happened to me. It's a cold night while I write this account and review the footage. The electricity has just been cut off suddenly, plunging my house into darkness. A chill is running down my spine now. I sense that something bad is about to happen. I just heard a noise in the kitchen now and outside. I think it's footsteps. I'm gonna take a look out the window. I just saw that there are 3 black cars parked in front of the house now. Firm, heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs now, followed by the sound of doors being broken down. I took a look at the cameras and saw men in black suits with cold expressions and relentless determination breaking into my house. I knew my time had come. Now I'm hiding in a compartment here in my office, but they will soon find me. I'm very scared, but I have no other escape. If you find this account, it means I have been captured or killed, so I ask you, please show this account and spread the word about the whole truth about the God experiment. Please, I'm not asking you to do this for me, but for the other people who will die because of this damned experiment, I beg you, spread this to the world. They've just entered the office where I'm hiding. In a few minutes or seconds, they'll find me. So, with a heavy heart, I say goodbye here, goodbye. Signed, Dr. Richard Thompson.